responded to this, please do, channel 44 or session ID 104898. There are more than 16 people in here. I'm not good at a lot of things, but quick over-unders are reasonable. It's been raining every day for like 2 months. It does suck.
I told my mom she's gonna start crying when I wake up. She's like, don't do that. I was like, I wanted to be sunshine. He's like, this is ridiculous.
All right. Is anybody still trying to register their response? Okay. A couple more minutes. Here's an early fun fact while we're waiting for everybody to finish doing this. You know how when your hands and feet get wet, your skin gets all wrinkly? That's not actually because of saturation of water or anything. It's a neurological response. There are some people that have neurodegenerative diseases where they don't get that sort of wrinkly skin. And it's thought to be an adaptation such that you're increasing the surface area and then, in theory, increasing the friction that you would otherwise have in wet environments. So, how about the knuckles? Is that? Well, I can't give you extra credit for knowing one of the fun facts beforehand, but. You did.
Especially after you spend $400 million.
Yeah. All right. 22 more seconds. I would not spend that time asking questions and quickly pull out your clicker. For those of you all who have already responded, did you see that there was more than one question? Because it's only showing up here as there's one question, but I logged 3, and so I don't know why it's only showing. Huh? All right, well, answer this one question and then you'll get credit for it. I don't know what's not showing all 3 of them. Four, 3, 2, 1, the end. All right, next. Show results. All right, good. Almost everybody got the right answer there of imprinting. Adaptation in this context means nothing, so just FYI. Yeah. All right. Let's pull up today's slides. We're recording. Yes, we are recording. Perfect. Today, we are talking about moral development. But first, thank you all for your feedback last time. There were a couple of y'all who gave feedback but didn't write your name on the page. I don't think it was because you were shy about that feedback, because it wasn't necessarily scathing feedback. So if you go on and you feel like you're missing an extra credit point or 2, and don't lie to me, email me, because I think I had 1 or 2 pages that were not accounted for. But thank you, in fact, for that feedback. I think it was really helpful. And here are some of the general themes that came up. One would be more in-class examples, and I will absolutely work on that. If I provide an example that doesn't make sense, please feel free to stop me, ask me for another example, because there were a couple people that made comments about how the examples are helpful, but every once in a while there's an example I bring up that doesn't make sense, or the example is not different enough from what you may have covered in the book. And so let me know if you need another example. I would be more than happy to provide them. The second one is y'all wanting an exam review. So I am not going to take time out of class to do the exam review, just because in general we already have too much stuff to cover to actually take entire class periods and do an exam review. But I will try to block out 10 or 15 minutes on the last class before the exam for any last minute questions. That being said, I also have my office hours. So some of y'all have been great about coming to office hours to go over material. If you haven't, please do come to those. Those are on Friday from 8 to 10. And I get lonely if I'm sitting in there all by myself. So please come talk to me at least, even if you don't have questions. Another point was people wanted the Cengage due dates on Canvas. I don't know how to do that. So I'm going to, instead, at the end of every lecture, just tell you what the next assignment is due or when it's due. Yes?
It says the due dates on the Cengage assignments themselves.
In Canvas or on Cengage website? Yeah, so it will say it on Cengage website, so that's a good bet. Also, it says so on your syllabus. And as I said, the first couple classes, those assignments where it's on that same line are due that day. So where it's on the line, it's not when it opens, it's due on the day of the line it's on. But I will tell y'all at the end of every class what Cengage assignment is due the next period. If I forget one of these class periods and somebody notices I forget, please remind me so I can remind the entire class. Me not telling you is not an excuse, but I will do my best to actually remind y'all every time. But also, your best bet is just going on Cengage's website and seeing when the assignments are due. A couple other people wanted the Cengage due after class, and I thought about this before the actual semester started, and I went back and forth, but I decided that I wanted Cengage to be due before class because I want y'all to be able to come in to class with at least some framework of understanding that we can reference. But also, if you have questions, I want you to be able to ask them in class. Because if you have a question, chances are other people have questions. And if it's due after class, the problem is you may have questions that arise, but never have the opportunity to ask them in class. So while I appreciate that feedback, this is one of those ones I'm going to just kind of skip over because I do think it is important for you to at least be exposed to it before class. And then the final point was people wanted me to slow down to make note-taking easier, and I absolutely will work on trying to slow down to give you all some chances to take notes, but also keep in mind that all the slides are on Canvas under the File section. So you don't need to copy down verbatim what's on the slides. You should be paying mostly attention to what you can fill in based off of what I'm talking about in with what's on the slides on Canvas. So that should at least make note-taking a little bit easier. Also, this reminded me of some studies that show taking verbatim notes is actually not the best way of going about it, not writing down everything, but writing down concepts. Because when you're writing down concepts, you're forcing yourself to synthesize that information rather than just verbatim taking notes on exactly what I'm saying. So, also, I will still try to work on slowing down, but try to think about, okay, what are the major concepts that I can start pulling into my notes rather than just transcribing what I am saying. Questions or things that are not on here that you specifically want to have addressed? Cool. And one other point that came up, I think only one or two people addressed it, that it stinks to have something like Cengage where you have to pay for it and you're already paying so much for education. And I completely agree. I think I kind of screwed up by having y'all purchase the Cengage thing. I wasn't necessarily thinking about the fact that it is additional money that you're going to have to fork out when you're already paying a lot for the education. So that's a mea culpa. We're not going to stop doing the Cengage because at this point you will already paid for it. And I think it is a useful tool. But I apologize that I didn't necessarily consider the fact that it wasn't the best practice to have y'all pay for something in addition to what you're getting in class. So, thanks again for the feedback. I think it was really useful. And thank you for all the kind words, those of y'all that wrote them. And nobody was really mean. So, that made my heart happy. All right. What did we learn last time? Yeah. Piaget. What did we learn about Piaget? Okay. Well, that's good.
I know we learned
Mm-hmm.
Talk about stages.
We did. We talked about stages. Who can help her out with Piaget?
A child develops stages.
Uh-huh. And what were those stages?
Sensory, motor, pre-operational, concrete, operational, and formal.
Okay. Awesome. What else did we talk about? Yeah.
Types of development.
I'm sorry?
Types of development.
Okay. And what did we talk about in that context?
Like we talked about cognitive development
Mm-hmm.
and social and emotional development.
Yeah, so we laid out the first about year and a half, 2 years of cognitive, social, physical, and communication development. Yeah. Learned about attachment? Yeah. So what did we learn about attachment?
That there are different sensitive and insensitive response, anxious attachment and avoidant attachment.
Yeah, so can you kind of describe or give me an example of anxious attachment?
Anxious is like they want that and avoidant they don't want it. They want to stay far away from whoever trying to be with.
Yeah. So anxious attachment is that kind of insecure attachment under that insecure attachment umbrella. Anxious attachment is kind of this fear of being rejected or losing somebody. And that's where we get into kind of this colloquial term of clingy. They're really holding on. They don't want to risk letting somebody go. Avoidant attachment would be somebody who tends to push people away as they get closer. Yes, and again, those all fit under that insecure attachment. What would be secure attachment? Yeah.
You have like really good relationships and friendships with people, and you're not worried about them moving or stuff like that. You feel pretty comfortable.
Yeah.
You want to form relationships.
Exactly. So it's a really kind of quintessentially healthy relationship builder. So somebody who has a lot of close friends, has healthy relationships with their significant other, aren't pushing them away when they're getting too close, or aren't kind of being the jealous, over clingy, concerned all the time type. Exactly. Give me one more thing we learned last time. Yeah.
Kohlberg's theory of moral development.
Okay. And what did Kohlberg have to say?
That there are like I think 3 stages of development, which is pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional.
Okay. And within each one of those, there were kind of 2 additional levels for each of those. But you see the progression from kind of this early moral reasoning of what matters is just avoiding any sort of pain or discomfort or conflict for me as the individual. You tend to see this in really young kids. All the way up to kind of what is this last level, this last stage? Yeah.
Where you have like your own set of moral codes that you're following over to the law.
Yeah, so you have these kind of, this belief in certain moral principles that transcend the law, right? Some of the earlier adherents, according to Kohlberg, would be that the law kind of supersedes anything else, right? It's obedience, it's willingness to abide with authority. And so Kohlberg is saying that this last level is kind of this belief in a universal moral truth that we, as individuals, would want to follow, to implement in lieu of adherence to this sort of authority. Any questions about what we talked about last time? Cool. So today is going to be more of a conversation about moral development. I think this is a really unique concept because this is where you start bridging the gaps between all these different fields, and depending on the amount of time we have left at the end of class, we're going to do an activity where that'll be a little bit more obvious. But this is really where conversations with neuroscientists, psychologists, philosophers, computer scientists, everybody across the spectrum come together to start debating these concepts, right? It's really easy, as we talked about with Kohlberg's stages, to say that there are these kind of concrete truths, or there are these things that we should all adhere to, but hopefully by the end of the day, you'll start to see at least some of the conflict associated with that sort of belief, the reasoning to it, and how this starts to inform some of our public policy debates, right? You'll see some examples I bring up of the different really hot-button topics and hot-button issues politically that are motivated by these different adherences to belief in morals. But first, your fun fact of the day, wombat poop is cube-shaped. I don't know how that works, but it is cube-shaped. There you go. There's also a very fancy brand of coffee where they feed the beans to like goats or something, I think.
So like some sort of like raccoon, like an Indian raccoon, and they spit out and they take the beans as coffee.
Yeah.
Some people say that
So
the
it's
best
just like,
coffees.
Yeah.
apparently it's good, so.
Well, people also say escargot's good. I'm not eating snails. That's weird. All right.
It is though.
Nah, it's not. Moralization.
You haven't tried it.
No. Moralization allows us to make the distinction between what we would say is immoral. So, for example, killing is wrong. I'm relatively certain that I don't want to be killed, nor do I want to kill anybody, except for those who interrupt class. Just kidding. Things that are disagreeable. Things like I hate Brussels sprouts.
That's
Things that are unfashionable. So, for example, bell bottoms are out. I would say mullets are out, but that's clearly not true anymore. Or things that are imprudent. So things like don't scratch mosquito bites because that'll only make them itch more. And so you should be able to see kind of this continuum when we talk later about how we can inform morality or how we can reason to morality. Why some people may be mistaking this sort of imprudent judgments with immoral judgments. And the rules it invokes are felt to be universal. Right? They're not dependent on culture. They're not dependent on gender or age. But anything that we have determined is a moral truth can be said to be universal. And so certain things can become moralized over time. It's been really interesting to watch in my lifetime the moralization of a thing like smoking. Right? When I was growing up, you could smoke in any restaurant, any bar. But then we kind of moralized smoking to the point now where it's seen as immoral to smoke around non-smokers because you could be damaging their health. Can anybody think of other things that have become moralized, maybe even within your lifetime?
Cursing.
Cursing. Okay, give me an example. Like, you mean it's become okay or not okay?
It depends who you're around. I feel like the older generation still find it offensive, but the younger generation has just made it as a, oh, everyone does it, it's fine, just ignore it type thing.
Yeah. Yeah, so we've kind of changed our moral perspective. I think in our grandparents' generation, it was seen as an example of kind of emotional and intellectual depravity. But we're clearly a little bit more fast and loose with curse words in our generation. Yeah?
I hesitate to say this, but it's true, but homosexual relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the things we're going to be talking about today are political hot-button topics. And I want you to speak up. Don't self-censor in this case. But yeah, it's been really interesting to see over the last decade how quickly not only homosexual relationships have been accepted by society, but kind of this moralizing of any sort of discrimination, right? We want to be accepting of all people from all different walks of life. So again, we've established this kind of new societal moral wherein it is immoral to discriminate against any group or subculture. Amoralization would be more, I think, of the example of cursing. So you're switching from what's perceived to be moral failings to instead a lifestyle choice. So Steven Pinker and Jonathan Haidt will be two names you'll hear a lot as it relates to moral psychology, and they're both fantastic writers, really brilliant guys. But Pinker, in discussing this sort of amoralization, includes things like divorce, illegitimacy, being a working mother, marijuana use, homosexuality, etc. These are all things that at one point were seen as deeply immoral, but now we've kind of societally come to the point where we're saying it's not necessarily that they are immoral, they're just lifestyle choices. Here's a fun fact about divorce. I'm sure you all have heard that 50% of marriages end in divorce. That's nowhere near true. That's one of these pervasive myths that have continued on. I don't know where that number comes from. I mean, it's a faulty old survey that has pushed it out and has continued to be pervasive. But the divorce rate, especially among higher educated people, is nowhere near that. I think it may not even be in double digits. So that's at least something good for those of y'all who want to eventually get married. Is that a hand?
Well, the divorce thing
Yeah.
reminds me of the 45% cops thing.
I'm not familiar with that one.
You know, they say 45% first responders commit domestic abuse, but that was an outdated study.
Yeah, there are a lot of kind of these pervasive studies. So we have our own beliefs about morality and what becomes moral or immoral. Right? And you see this sort of amoralization or moralization on sides of really kind of pervasive and combative issues. So things like kneeling or standing for the national anthem, both sides of this topic think that they have the moral high ground. And we'll see some examples when we start talking about Jonathan Haidt's primary colors of morality, of what kind of beliefs these people are adhering to. But you'll hear this sort of moralization of people's arguments on both sides. Also things like pro-life and pro-choice. Right? What are you moralizing in this case? Are you moralizing in relation to the baby? Are you moralizing in relation to the mother? And so again, you can start to see how different sides of contentious debates are driven largely by this sort of moralization or amoralization of these different topics as a function of what are you valuing, what are these primary colors that we'll talk about later on today, are you prioritizing over the other? And you'll also see this all the time. If everybody wants the moral high ground, right? Nobody really goes out in their life and says, yeah, I'm going to seek the moral low ground or the low road. Some people behave that way, but it's rarely the case that people's goals and intentions are to seek that low moral standing, right? And so their judgments, their beliefs are intertwined such that you'll hear people say things like it's an immoral act if one fails to act against climate change, or abortion is an immoral medical action. So again, you see this sort of moralization on all sides of these issues to inform people's decision making. this sort of moral high ground also leads to what's sometimes called virtue signaling, right? So you have these certain virtues, or things that you think are virtuous, that through certain actions, you're showing the world what you hold in high esteem. Things like the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, right? You want to be seen in high moral standing or using the high moral ground. This is how things like this become so unbelievably viral, because nobody wants to be that person who is challenged to do it and says, no, I don't care about ALS. Right? You want to have that high moral ground, but it also is a simple and easy and frequently fun way of demonstrating this sort of moral high ground, this moral position. You also see things like the 22 push-ups a day challenge, or veteran suicide, or the breast cancer awareness Wear Pink Days. All examples of us establishing this kind of moral judgment which dictates our actions, or ascribing it to beliefs. However, there are also kind of these secondary effects of this type of acting. And one example is what we call moral licensing. So behaving in a good way now makes you more likely to behave in a bad way later on. So think about this kind of very colloquially. You say, I went to the gym today, so now I can eat those 3 slices of cake. Right? I was good, and so now I can afford to be just a little bad. The unfortunate truth is, some of these viral sensations, these viral trends, like the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge, are bad for charity overall, because people pour the ice on their head and feel like they did something good. And so now, even though there's frequently an attachment of, and donate $10 to this charity, people feel like, I've already done enough raising this awareness, I'm not going to donate. Or if they donate even a little bit, that's detracting from the amount that they would donate to other charities. And so you can actually plot this as you have these viral trends, like the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. Donations to other charities actually decrease. Yeah?
I think there's a kind of a slang term for that nowadays. It's called slacktivism.
Okay.
It's when you don't really do anything, but you're pretending like you're doing something.
Yeah, so you've established this kind of moral position. And again, it's not a bad thing to participate in this, right? I suspect a lot more people now know something about ALS that didn't know it before. But you see how this kind of moralization of certain actions can lead to these secondary consequences. And this is all to start painting a picture of the complexities of kind of moral reasoning, moral absolutism, as we'll talk about later, moral relativism. And if you haven't seen this episode of The Office, where Meredith, one of the employees in the office, finds out that she has rabies, they only find this out because Michael, the main character here, hit her with his car, and they had to take her to the hospital, and when she was at the hospital, they found out she had rabies, and so he feels like he actually did some good, that he broke a curse by hitting her with the car, and then they're going to do this, I forget the exact name, but a fun run, Race for the Cure, and he talks about all the good that they're doing by doing this race. They wind up donating like $100 via somebody that Michael's tricked into thinking is a nurse, but is really just a stripper dressed as a nurse. It's a really good episode. Just go watch it. All right, so critical thinking, talk with your neighbor. What drives us to amoralize something? Namely, what is that precipitating factor in society that leads us to determine or decide that something that was perceived to be immoral is now no longer immoral, is now okay? 37 more seconds. All right, so what are your thoughts? What drives us to amoralize things? Yeah.
What a lot of people do, I feel like people are like, okay, like for example, divorce.
Yeah.
I feel like I know a lot of people that have a divorce and it makes it seem like, all right, cool, I can continue to divorce and everybody else has one.
Yeah, exactly. So there's this sort of attachment of, okay, well, everybody's doing it, so it can't be that bad, right? I mean, once you start knowing people who have gotten a divorce, that kind of destigmatizes it in some way, right? Things that are perceived to be moral or immoral usually have some sort of value judgment attached to it, right? So if in previous generations they saw divorce as immoral, getting a divorce was an indication of kind of poor character or poor moral standing. But then we kind of grew up as a culture and realized that telling women who are in abusive relationships to stay with their husband because getting a divorce is immoral is not necessarily more moral, right? And so you can start to amoralize things like divorce because you do start seeing potential benefits associated with, in certain circumstances, getting a divorce. What else?
Kind of goes along with what you said about a lack of experience. So when a culture is prone to not experiencing something, then they kind of forget about actual advice. So, they think it's more.
Yeah, exactly. So seeing firsthand exposure to certain things can lead you to moralize or amoralize something, right? And it's one of the reasons a lot of historians think things like the Vietnam War and Korea were good for civil rights here in America because now you had black and white soldiers fighting together and saying, oh wait, we're really not all that different, and look, now you've got my back in these environments. So now they came back to the U.S. and started advocating for these kind of advances in civil rights. So yeah, you can kind of destigmatize a lot of these things that we had previously moralized as a function of just repeated exposure to whatever those things are in life. And it's why you see things like marijuana legalization. After a first state does it, it kind of destigmatizes it a little bit. It no longer seems fringe. And so now there's less of a moral stigmata attached to the smoking of marijuana and the growth and distribution of marijuana, such that regardless of where you fall on the spectrum of thinking it's a good idea, you can at least see how this trend in society is precipitated by repeated exposure to people who smoke marijuana. Good. And so we can largely break up kind of moral philosophy into two major categories: collectivism and individualism. Collectivism focuses on morals as they apply to the group, to the collective. So what is best for the collective is right. Now you're going to see a really interesting example here wherein we can pull real-world events like the coronavirus, right? In the U.S., we have a run on these masks. Why? Because people don't want to get sick, right? They want to be wearing these masks to prevent themselves from getting sick. If you watch in a lot of these Eastern countries, in China, especially after like SARS, you saw a lot of this as well. People are wearing masks because they're concerned about getting other people sick. They're not worried about getting themselves sick. So you can see how this kind of moral philosophy folds into this idea that what's good for the collective is the moral position. And it tends to be more of these Eastern countries, these Asian countries, that have more of a philosophy of this kind of collectivist moralism. You could say, for example, that Dwight is being very collectivist here by suggesting it's immoral to keep Meredith alive when you could potentially cool off people for 2 days with a small fan. Same episode, the rabies episode, go watch it. It will change your life. It probably won't change your life, but it's very good. So the flip side of that is this individualism. Right? The belief that moral worth is inherent to the individual rather than the collective. And again, you see this in this kind of philosophy of Western countries versus Eastern countries with this face mask wearing of, am I concerned about my own well-being or am I concerned about everybody else's well-being? Now, obviously, it's not as simple as saying individualism or collectivism is right. It's usually a hybrid between the two. Right? There was just a case up in, I think it was New Hampshire, where somebody was told they were diagnosed with the coronavirus and were told to isolate themselves, and instead they went to a party. They should have been a little bit more collectivist thinking there.
Rather share the world.
Yeah. And this tends to manifest, like I said, in these Western societies, and you'll see a lot of this kind of individualism manifest in government documents. So, for example, in the Declaration of Independence, among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, talking about the individual rights inherent to you as a person rather than the collective of society. You can also break it up in terms of relativism or absolutism for our morals. Moral relativism suggests that there are no absolute morals. You can't make moral judgments about people in other societies or other cultures. That every society, every culture has its own kind of perceived morality, and that it's wrong to suggest that their morality is incorrect and our morality is correct. And you'll see this frequently where you have these kind of culture clashes around the world. One of the causes of this culture clash, is this relativism for each culture of what is moral versus amoral. Right? If I come from a culture where eating tuna fish is amoral, and I go to a culture where they only eat tuna fish, we're going to have a butting of the head. Now, clearly that's an example, an absurdist example. But you can see how this relativism fits in there. The flip side of this is what we call absolutism. That there are universal moral or ethical principles that underpin everything we do, and that morality does not get to be dictated by individual cultures or societies, but that there is a ground truth of morality, and everybody should be striving towards becoming moral on these grounds. And you can see how relativism and absolutism, collectivist versus individualism, can all intersect, right? If we think it's an absolute truth that it's more moral to consider the individual than the collective, you can see how that starts butting heads with people who think it's an absolute truth that the collective matters more than the individual. Now, frequently, moral absolutists say that you can reason to morality. Science and reason can allow you to get to a ground truth of morality, the absolute morality. And this reasoning versus rationalization depicts kind of two different ways people get at it. So reasoning allows you to start from principles. What are the principles that, to steal a phrase, you hold self-evident? And then you derive your moral position. You derive your beliefs from. Rationalizing, on the other hand, comes from this initial gut reaction and then backfilling reasons to substantiate your gut feeling. Right? If I asked you what's better, McDonald's or Wendy's, I'm sure all of you right off the bat would have some strongly held view, but without ever really having thought critically about it. Once you give me your answer, you can backfill and say that the answer is obviously Wendy's, because their burgers are just more delicious, their fries are thicker, they don't put weird Thousand Island copies on their burgers like McDonald's does.
Burgers are cold.
No, they're delicious.
The 2 times I went there, it was cold.
And so you can rationalize to that position, but reasoning to that position would say, okay, what do I care about in a burger joint? Well, I tend to like fries that are not necessarily crispy, they're a little bit more soft, more surface area upon which I can deliver ketchup. I like burgers that have crisper lettuce. All right, so now let me evaluate against these. Sorry if anybody out here is a McDonald's fan. I eat way too much McDonald's anyway, so don't worry about it. But you can start to see the distinction between reasoning and rationalizing. Now, a lot of people, most people, approach things from this sort of rationalizing perspective. They've got a gut instinct about why something is the way it is, but have not spent the time to kind of reason to why that is. And from my own perspective, this is one of the issues associated with trying to prevent certain things from being said, right? We can all agree that there are certain things that are heinously offensive or even damaging out there. But if people's proclivity is to rationalize their moral positions, not being forced to reason their positions makes them more likely to fall victim to people showing reasoning that is perceivably compelling in favor of that opposing view. Right? I'm sure almost everybody, if not everybody in here, believes that the earth is round and not flat. And if you don't, I don't know what to tell you. But when we think about this, most of us don't have any empirical evidence that the earth is round. We have strongly held views that the earth is round. We've been told that the earth is round. But we're all kind of rationalizing it, where our gut instinct is if somebody's a flat earther to say, you're an idiot. Even if they're not an idiot. Because we rationalize this, and how people fall victim to beliefs like the flat earth theory is because somebody can come to you with this really good reasoning, this reasoning that seems compelling, and because you've never seen reasoning before, your response is now to say, oh my God, the facts say the earth is flat. Right? So this is why when big companies like YouTube try to combat some of these theories like flat earth, they've done a good job in certain circumstances, not just removing flat earth videos, but providing additional evidence below those videos. So any of these kind of conspiracy theories, additionally, they're trying to combat reasoning with reasoning, understanding that people tend to rationalize. And so as long as we can backfill that information and allow people to reason with actual evidence, we can help combat this kind of ignorance or belief in things that are not true. However, the problem with reasoning to any individual moral position is something that I alluded to several lectures ago. It was called Hume's guillotine. And this is a purely philosophical position, but I think it's helpful when we think about morality to understand the limitations of reason with morality. Hume's guillotine says that you cannot derive what you ought to do from an observation about what is true about the world. Sometimes also called the is-ought problem. So, for example, it would be logically incorrect for me to say, it's cold outside, therefore you should wear a coat. Because what I've done is presuppose that you don't want to be cold. Now, this is a very kind of ground level example, but you can start to deconstruct all of these reasoned to moral arguments, understanding that every one of these is kind of presupposing a certain morality. Well, is it self-evident that that's how the morality should be? What is that belief based upon? It's logically correct to say it's cold outside, therefore if you don't want to be cold, you should wear a coat. But presupposition that it is moral to not be cold is a jump in logic. It's requiring everybody to agree on this supposition, this foundation, before we can start to make sense of what we ought to do in our environment. So this leads us to Jonathan Haidt's kind of 5 primary colors, or 5 themes, or 5 moral principles, whatever you want to call them, that Haidt says are instilled in us from birth. Right? These are not things that we are reasoning to. These are not necessarily religious moral principles. He's saying these are things we are born with that are, to some degree, universal. And you can see how different cultures may weight, or different belief systems may weight one or more of these themes over another. And we'll go over each one of these in detail in just a second. But any questions about what we've covered so far? Cool. So those 5 themes are harm, fairness, community, authority, and purity. Harm is represented by this dichotomous choice here. Is it more immoral to stick a needle in your own palm, or stick a needle or pin into the palm of a child you don't know? Most people are going to say the second one's more immoral. Right? It is, in Haidt's view, immoral to cause harm to others, that we have this kind of belief about what should and should not be done to others. You can do things to yourself, but doing those things to others causes a moral conundrum. Can somebody else think of another example that would fit in with this harm label? Yeah.
Like with the smoking, it's okay to smoke if you're alone because you're just hurting yourself, but if you're around other people,
Exactly.
it's hurting them.
Yeah. So that kind of moralization of something like smoking adheres to this harm principle, wherein we say, I don't care if you smoke, do it by yourself, but you just can't do it in a way that's going to harm others. You see this with like drinking and driving, right? We don't care if you drink. Drink as much as you want at home, or get a taxi, but don't do things that could potentially harm others that are not you. The second one is fairness. So if I were to ask you what's more fair or what's more moral, to accept a widescreen TV from a friend who received it at no charge because of a computer error, or to accept a widescreen TV from a friend who received it from a thief who had stolen it. Most people's belief is that the first one would be more fair. Right? You can start to complicate it by adding things like a wealthy family, right? These qualifiers that can start to tease apart people's moral beliefs. But we tend to kind of err on the side of fairness, regardless of this collectivist or individualist mentality. We want things to be fair such that accepting a stolen good is inappropriate and unfair. Can somebody think of another example of fairness? Really good at waiting. Well, so this undergirds kind of even old folklore or tales about things like Robin Hood, right? So one of the reasons Robin Hood is still frequently used today is a conversation of what's more fair. Is it fair to rob from anybody to pay anybody? Or is it more fair to provide people with the opportunities to then move up their lot in life, right? And you see that in the conversations about things like capitalism versus socialism, right? What are you ascribing is more fair? We have this proclivity towards describing everything in terms of fairness. Community. So, if I were to ask you what seems more immoral, to say something bad about your nation, which you don't believe, on a talk radio show in your nation, or to say something bad about your nation, which you don't believe, on a talk radio show in another nation. Most people, man, that's a little voice crack there. Most people tend to think that the second one is more immoral, right? It's a betrayal of community. You can say bad things to your friends in your friend group, but going outside of your friend group to badmouth somebody, to say those exact same things, seems immoral and like a betrayal of something. Right? So adherence to kind of this closed community allows me to say the same things, but who that audience is dictates whether we see it as fair or not. The next is authority. So we see it as more immoral to slap a friend in the face with his permission as part of a comedy skit? Or do we see it as more appropriate to slap, for example, your minister in the face with his permission as part of a comedy skit? Most people tend to think it's more appropriate to slap your friend than it is to slap your minister, even though they've both given you their permission because of this sort of deference to authority. That's why rebelling against authority figures feels even more, what's the word I'm looking for? Influential or important, because you feel like you're doing something most people know explicitly, in your mind, is wrong to do, right? You're acting against this for what you see. You're acting in an immoral way for what you see as a greater moral good. Can anybody give me another example of authority? Yeah.
Well, it's really apparent in the one study where they were like fake shocking people, but they thought it was real. And it was like they were harming somebody, but the scientist telling them to do it took precedent over hurting somebody else.
Yeah, exactly. So we have this old experiment that was born out of curiosity, this kind of morbid curiosity following World War II, where people said, how could so many people be receptive to these ungodly, what we perceive to be immoral orders of the SS or the Nazis? Right? Some of the conversations immediately after it was, are Germans just uniquely susceptible to this crap, or are they immoral? Well, the series of studies that came after, one of these was the Milgram Obedience Study, showed that, I forget the exact numbers, but something like 70% of the American, they were all men in this case, but 70% of the Americans in the study were willing to go to a level of shock of somebody that they thought was killing them, just because somebody in a lab coat said continue. Right? And so, it's this kind of obedience to authority. That lab coat instilled in people this belief that this was an authoritative figure that they had to listen to abide by. And the final is purity. So what seems more immoral or more impure? Attending a performance art piece in which the actors act like idiots for 30 minutes, including flubbing simple problems and falling down on stage, or attending a performance art piece in which the actors act like animals for 30 minutes, including crawling around naked and urinating on stage. Right? Most people's initial reaction, as evidenced by some of your physical reaction, is that the second one is more impure, it's more inappropriate, more kind of shocking. And thus, we have this kind of internal moral principle that what is pure is more moral. That's why impure acts tend to be the most captivating and sensationalizing. You think about some of those extreme vegan protests where they strip down and dump blood on their heads, right? That seems like a very impure thing to do in a deliberate attempt to make people pay attention because of this sort of violation of morality. I think the subconscious belief being, if you're willing to violate morality to get your point across, this must be something worth paying attention to. All right, so talk with your neighbor. Think about the principles which you believe to be moral, and then how each of those 5 primary colors may apply to it. So one example would be adages like women and children first. Which of those 5 moral principles or 5 primary colors would apply to that? Now use something other than this example. Come up with your own sort of moral belief. And then we'll all talk together. 17 more seconds. All right. Some brave soul, give me a moral principle you believe. Gotta be some moral principle. Yeah.
We said yes, like saying yes ma'am and no ma'am.
Okay. So, saying yes ma'am, no ma'am, just ma'am or sir as well? Okay, so both. So which of those 5 primary colors does this adhere to? The third, which one? Authority, yes. Yeah, so explain that one. Explain your reasoning why it's authority.
Well, it's like what's acceptable. It's like around here, it's like it's unacceptable to not say it.
Yeah, right? Because even if the person is not necessarily an authority figure in any way other than they're just older than you, it's kind of this deference of, believing that the elderly in a community, or not even the elderly, but those who are older, have something to offer society that you don't have. Yeah. Great. Give me another example. Yeah.
Treating others how you want to be treated.
Yeah, that golden rule, right? Treat others how you want to be treated. Which one of these 5 themes apply to that? And it can be more than one.
Fairness.
Fairness, okay. Why fairness?
Basically because, say you meet somebody and you're like, oh, screw you, out of nowhere, they're probably not going to like you. And now the day they can live in, they get pissed off, they're going to probably kill you.
Yeah. Well, so there's part of this kind of self-preservation aspect of it. But the fairness also indicates that, from a purely, almost probabilistic perspective, if you act in a certain way and are more likely to have other people act in that same way, you acting in a fair manner to everybody else increases the chances that they act in a fair way to you, right? And so stealing from your neighbor is immoral because it violates that sort of fairness for your neighbor, but it also violates the sense of fairness for you as the individual, right? You don't want somebody to come and steal from you. Somebody give me one more example. Yeah.
If you should keep the $100 you find on the floor and try to figure out who it wants to.
Yeah, so you see all these videos on YouTube, for example, of people doing this type of experiment where they drop $100 and see who returns it, who looks for somebody to get that. And most people, at least would like to say that they'll return that $100. Which one does this adhere to?
There's fairness, but I think also probably community, depending on, like, if you're around, like, if you're in a place that you know a lot of people in, you might be more likely to return it than if you weren't.
Yeah, exactly. So I live way down in Lacey Spring. It's a small community. I'm much more likely to do something benevolent in my community, just probabilistically, than I would be in downtown Huntsville. Exactly. So community, fairness, maybe even the harm, if you're seeing it as a harm to somebody. Exactly. Yep. Is that a hand? Yeah, so I mean, I guess it depends on what do you determine is purity. Usually it's discussed as kind of this physical purity, but, sneezing on others we think is kind of immoral because it's physically impure. But I think there could be an argument to be made that it would also be a sense of purity. So, this all serves to kind of highlight the complexity associated with morality. We all think about morality as if it's this kind of obvious truth. We don't spend much of our day thinking about, is this more immoral than that? Again, because we rationalize, we have these gut feelings, and then we argue based off of our backfilling of that data. But one of the things that I'm really interested in, because of my research, is the development of things like artificial intelligence. Right? We talk about artificial intelligence, or artificial general intelligence, eventually, of getting to potentially human-level capabilities. May not be on our life scale, but presumably eventually. And then we talk about wanting these systems to behave morally. Right? There are so many of these dystopian movies where the AI rises up and kills all of humans. Right? It's obviously an intrinsic fear we have. And so we want to instill in these systems a sense of morality. But keep in mind that these systems themselves are not necessarily anything other than more logical than us. So you can't get it to reason to morality because of things like Hume's guillotine. But you still don't want to be in a position where you have to come up with every possible scenario and how this AI should react given what we believe is a moral principle. So, based off of what we talked about today, for example, individualism versus collectivism, a belief in absolutism versus relativity, Haidt's moral principles, what should we instill in an AI system and why? There's no wrong answer. There's also no right answer, but let me take a shot. Yeah.
I feel like something that an AI would think morally is whether they would actually harm to others. The way I think about it is, if something, for example, building like a robot with an AI system, if the robot can do a self-analysis or diagnosis, see if whatever an external harm, and if the external harm is affecting its existence, then it might have a motive to actually, terminate away.
Yeah. And so this is kind of echoed in something like Isaac Asimov's, I think, 3 laws of robotics. Right? The first one, do no harm to humans. The problem with things like that is we have to define what harm is. Right? Does anybody want to go into medicine in any capacity? Okay. So we have the Hippocratic Oath, right? Which says what? Do no harm. Is performing open heart surgery doing some sort of harm? Yes, right? I mean, creating an incision, opening somebody up, is at least to some degree doing harm. Right? So we've agreed that do no harm doesn't really mean do no harm. We've agreed that do no harm means try to maximize the outcome while minimizing that actual harm. But now that presupposes that living is preferable to dying. You can all say, I don't want to die, but you can't reason to why you don't want to die. And so having a robot or an AI system that can understand the parameters of what we have essentially illogically determined we mean by harm is a lot more difficult than we want to believe in these conversations. Right? If you go to therapy, sometimes the first steps of therapy are getting you to relive trauma. That's obviously causing short-term harm, with the goal that we're maximizing this output, but that's not guaranteed. And so how do you then start weighing, okay, what is harm in these different environments? What is appropriate actions? What should you want to do? And how do you kind of weigh what we kind of have this gut level instinct about, but are not really reasoning to it all that intelligently? Does somebody else have another thing that they would want to instill in these systems? Is that a hand? Yeah.
Another one is if an AI gets to become advanced enough to understand morality. I feel like one thing that could be instilled is something like loyalty. For example, loyalty to some sort of administrative system where would it continue to follow whatever the administrator would like input into it, or would it actually consider whether what it's executing it, what the administrator is giving it, whether if it's good or bad?
Yeah, so kind of this adherence to authority in that capacity, right? You can see the potential upside if that authority is a benevolent entity, but you can also see the obvious downside if that entity becomes somebody like Hitler, right? You're telling these systems to do something. They believe adherence to authority is the moral thing to do, and therefore carry out that action. But that's an action that we believe, subsequently, is immoral to perform. But again, you have to develop in this sort of understanding of ability to make these systems as autonomous as we are, the ability to make their own decisions. And as part of that, an understanding of the complexities of moral reasoning. Right? And so hopefully this serves to at least illustrate the fact that we take a lot of things for granted in the way that we believe people should act. Right? Think about if you can reason to something being more moral than not. Right? One of the most ground truth things that we believe is more moral than not is don't kill. Right? But why? Why is it more moral to live than to take somebody's life? Right? We all don't want to die, and so we use that as kind of our backfill in there. But even these things that we agree societally and culturally are these moral absolutes you can't reason to necessarily, because you have this presupposition about what is good versus what is not. And that's where you start getting into some of these gray areas of reproducing intelligence, having to instill in it these certain kind of Bayesian priors or these beliefs that we have, but you can't necessarily reason to. So, next time, Cengage Chapter 12 is due before class. I think it's before class. It's class at 10 p.m. Yeah, 10 p.m. Monday night. Yes, so if you have any questions, come talk to me. Otherwise, have a good weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday.